Now it's time for me to introduce Dr. Liz Deakin. She's a landscape ecologist, has a postdoc position at CIFOR, the Center for International Forestry Research, based in Indonesia. And Liz and some colleagues at CIFOR has performed a systematic review on the landscape approach. But let us hear what Liz has to say about this. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Frederick, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I'll cover various things associated with landscape approaches and reconciling competing land uses, including more information on that systematic review. So I'll just give you a brief outline of some of the themes that I'm going to cover in my talk today. Firstly, I'll give a quick summary of the landscape approach framework and its purpose for reconciling competing land uses and how the landscape approach is interlinked with the new Sustainable Development Goals. I'll talk about the development of the framework and other key approaches and interventions that have contributed to the landscape approach concept. And I'll also be talking about the systematic review in quite some depth that myself and colleagues at CIFOR are still currently undertaking. We're conducting a systematic review map where we've been synthesizing the literature to establish how the landscape approach framework has evolved and where and under what circumstances it's been implemented in the tropics. And finally, I'll conclude by raising some of the issues that we've identified throughout this systematic reviewing process concerning the barriers between the theory of the concept and implementation and on the ground, and come up with some suggestions for more effective implementation of the landscape approach. So there's been growing recognition that traditional sectorial approaches to global challenges such as biodiversity conservation, poverty alleviation, food production, and climate change are no longer working, and we need to find a more holistic, integrated solution to these large-scale problems. The pressing challenge of integrated management is to link up multiple land use practices and encourage joined-up thinking at the landscape scale. Landscape approaches seek to provide tools and concepts for allocating and managing land to achieve social, economic, and environmental objectives in areas where agriculture, timber extraction, mining, and other productive land uses compete with environmental and biodiversity goals. Integrated landscape approaches provide a framework for balancing these competing demands. So the aim of landscape approaches is to accommodate multifunctionality and adaptive management at multiple scales, including multiple stakeholders and sectors. And ultimately, the aim is to create resilience to global challenges concerning sustainable land management.
We make sure you will have extra time.
Thank you. So the importance of landscape approaches is paramount. 3 billion people living in rural areas are dependent on agriculture and forestry for their livelihoods. And this has been widely recognized in the recent UN Sustainable Development Goals, which call for holistic and integrated approaches to sustainable development that restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystems. And these are sentiments that resound strongly with that endorse landscape approaches. And given that at least 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the key terrestrial objectives, achieve food security and improve nutrition and hunger, and promote sustainable agriculture, secure water, tackle climate change, promote strong, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, and particularly goal number 15, which is protect, restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably managed forests and halt biodiversity loss. There is clearly a strong overlap with the desired outputs of a landscape approach. So when you consider the strength of these overlaps, it's difficult to argue against the viability of a landscape approach as a framework for achieving sustainable land management and also for helping to fulfill the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we use the term landscape approach or integrated landscape approach as an umbrella concept that encompasses many existing terms and approaches related to integrated land management. So next, I'll summarize how the approach has evolved and some of the interlinked frameworks that have led the way, as it were, to the landscape approach gaining renewed traction. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that a landscape approach is not a new concept. It's actually been documented in the literature under various guises over the past 3 decades, and conservation issues in particular have traditionally been tackled on a landscape scale for quite some time, and emerging sciences such as ecosystem management, landscape ecology and island biogeography, dating back as far as the 1960s, have contributed to conservation-rooted frameworks such as the ecosystem approach. WWF also introduced the Integrated Conservation and Development Projects in the mid-1980s. However, despite initial promise, both frameworks failed to achieve a lot of their key objectives, particularly in terms of reconciling conservation and development issues. The ICDPs in particular have been criticised for being too heavily focused on conservation issues with little inclusion of rural livelihood objectives. Conversely, there have also been the integrated rural development approaches from the 1980s and 90s, and these have also been criticised and been under scrutiny for being too anthropocentric and therefore not addressing conservation issues sufficiently. There's also been the Integrated Natural Resource Management Framework, which was also established in the late 1990s. So the landscape approach can be reviewed as a refinement of these frameworks, and during the last decade there's been a lot more people-centred approaches to environmental management, and these have been embraced widely. There's been subsequent development of landscape frameworks from numerous institutions, NGOs and research organisations, and this has led to a plethora of similar concepts and initiatives. However, the term landscape approach has actually been documented in the literature since the early 1990s, again illustrating that this is not a new concept, yet we're still now trying to understand the framework sufficiently and how best to implement it on the ground. Now, these are just some of the many frameworks and initiatives that are interlinked with the landscape approach framework. Consequently, as Bjorn mentioned earlier, there's a rich terminology that has developed with the evolution of so many different approaches involving landscapes. And there's a significant institutional overlap in terms of the terminology used, and different practitioners are choosing to label their frameworks differently and coming up with different definitions for their approach as well. And this ultimately has led to a fragmentation of knowledge, unnecessary reinvention of ideas and practices, and ultimately, and most importantly, is slowing progress in terms of gaining policy traction. And a few years ago, in a study by Eco-Agriculture Partners, they identified 78 different terms, all alluding to integrated landscape management. So perhaps what we've done is create this sea of terminology that's actually hindering progress and engagement with policymakers, and as scientists, we're failing to deliver a coherent message. Another issue linked to the terminology problem is that there remains no single definition of a landscape approach, and Bjorn has just provided us with another one today. But perhaps this doesn't really matter, as a universal definition perhaps isn't necessary, because the landscape approach as a framework needs to be as dynamic as the landscape in which we're trying to apply it to. So to help gain some clarity through these muddy waters of terminology associated with these many frameworks and initiatives regarding landscape management, and to help synthesize the massive amounts of information currently available, myself and colleagues at CIFOR are currently undertaking a systematic review map entitled "What are Landscape Approaches and How Effectively Have They Been Implemented in the Tropics?" So the key objectives of the systematic review are to map the theory and development of the landscape approach, and consolidate and synthesize all of the existing definitions and conceptual frameworks from the many practitioners out there, and also to synthesize the current literature to identify geographically where and how landscape approaches have been implemented in practice by collating evidence from case studies on the ground. We want to identify what sectors are involved, what stakeholders are involved, and how governance is being applied to these case studies. And the idea behind this being that, the review being that we hope to deliver a more coherent message regarding the landscape management framework, and inform the development of a clear strategy on sustainable landscape scale management. So for those of you who are not aware of what a systematic review is and how it differs from a from a conventional review. Systematic review maps follow a transparent, repeatable, predetermined methodology to review a given research topic. They are commonly used in medical research, but in the last few years have been applied more to the natural and social sciences. And a systematic review follows preset guidelines and inclusion criteria throughout the review process. And this allows for a very comprehensive and structured review of the peer-reviewed literature, but can also include non-peer-reviewed literature, such as grey literature, including policy briefs, project reports, and website material. And systematic review maps are live reviews. They can be updated when new evidence comes available, which this doesn't usually happen with conventional reviews. So just to run through some of the methods that we applied to this review, we had multiple consultations within our author group at CIFOR and fellow colleagues at CIFOR in Indonesia, and also between other recognised experts in the field. We held 2 stakeholder workshops, one in Kenya at the Eco-Agriculture Partners event, Landscapes for Forest, Food and Nature, and also at the Association for Tropical Biology conference in Australia last year. And we came up with a preliminary selection of 56 search strings, all alluding to the landscape approach and interlinked frameworks. And we conducted an initial scoping exercise using Web of Science to test the appropriateness of these selected terms. And we found that this original set of 56 terms was capturing a manageable amount of literature. So we had to go back to the drawing board and pare down the number of terms into a more manageable amount to make sure that we could physically do the review, but also at the same time that all of the peer-reviewed articles that we were collating were relevant and appropriate to the research question. So all of the details related to the methodology can be found in the Reed et al. Publication, which is one of the key texts of this seminar. So as we had 2 components to our research question, the first being investigating the theory and conceptual development of the landscape approach framework, and the second being trying to find case studies where landscape approaches have been implemented on the ground. We developed criteria for this case study component of the research, and these were applied throughout the screening process of the literature. So we wanted case studies that demonstrated a clear and repeatable methodology. They needed to show evidence of integrating at least 2 land uses, and evidence of integrating at least 2 institutional or sectorial stakeholders. And they also needed to measure outcomes accurately and reliably. So from the set of refined search terms, skipping back a bit, with the original set of 56 search terms that we trialled, we got almost 300,000 peer-reviewed journal articles, and I don't really want to be doing this when I'm 50, so we decided to rethink a bit the search strings, but eventually we ended up with just over 13,000 peer-reviewed publications, which we titled we screened all of the titles of. And of all of those titles that were screened, almost 1,200 we screened their abstracts of, and then decided whether they were relevant or not to the research question. And from those, we ended up reading the full text of 382 relevant studies.
Please feel free. Please.
How do you actually define stakeholders?
This was Mr. Åke Barklund, a member of the Royal Academy of Forestry and Agriculture.
So stakeholders, we're defining either stakeholders that are occurring within the landscape itself, whether that be local authorities, community groups, and also external stakeholders, so government donors from elsewhere, and more high-level government positions.
Are you giving them different weights?
No, we just want evidence that there's multiple parties coming together in the formulation of the landscape project. And it's not just one party that are directing the project. It's multiple user groups.
Any other questions at this moment, please? Gentleman in the middle.
My name is Forstmann Forestry. I was was wondering whether is it necessary to. Oh, sorry.
Please use
Is
the
it necessary to add a new concept, if you like? It's not that new, but landscape approach. I mean, you mentioned all these other integrated rural development, area development, and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't we just go back and pick one that is the most appropriate, so to say?
Yeah, we could do, but as I mentioned before, the previous approaches have come under scrutiny for not addressing multiple goals and objectives. They've been either too conservation focused, or protected area focused, or too focused on rural development. And the idea behind this approach is that we're bringing all of those disciplines together in a holistic way under one overarching framework. So I think going back to one of those, it's kind of, we're going backwards and not forwards really, and hopefully this will provide a more collaborative framework to include those things as well. Shall I continue?
You have quite a lot of time. You still have 50 minutes if you would need that.
Yes.
So please feel free to go through this.
Okay.
Welcome.
So I just, is this working again? It is, okay. Right, so we ended up with 382 relevant studies, which we then extracted information relating to our research questions from, and screened all of the full text of those, and 82 of the studies we found were relevant to what we were interested in. However, I should point out here that we're still currently conducting a study quality assessment, which is quite a lengthy process for this number of papers, and therefore this figure is likely to change as we go through that process. So I've got some take-home results. As I said, we're still going through this review, but it's a work in progress. But we do have some information to share in that the main project focus or entry point for the case study part of the study, where a landscape approach had been implemented, we found that the main source of this was from a livelihoods perspective. There's a value missing there on the graph, but that's 29%, and that was closely followed by a forests entry point. So that's what the main project focus was. And the geographical distribution of the case studies, we found that from the peer-reviewed literature, there is a vast, almost half of the case studies we found were from Central Africa, and a pretty much even distribution in other continents. But I should clarify here that we were only limited to being able to conduct searches in English, and therefore this will likely skew the geographical distribution of the studies, but there's certainly scope for further reviews to be conducted in other languages, namely Spanish would be an important one. So the majority of the case studies started with a single objective focus, either a livelihoods entry point or a forest entry point, but what we did find was that they expanded and considered other land uses and other variables as challenges arose. So for example, a case study may have started with a reforestation program, but then also had to consider rural livelihood impacts as well. And of the case studies we found from the peer-reviewed literature, 83% of them reported positive outcomes. Now, we must take this with a pinch of salt, because generally people like to report positive messages in the literature. So yeah, pinch of salt there, but we also recognise that often results are based on short-term data collection and are usually conducted soon after the project has been implemented, and they're not often long-term projects. And linked to this, we found that no case studies so far demonstrate any long-term monitoring or evaluation of landscape metrics. And finally, of all the literature that we screened at the full text stage, 37% of papers explicitly acknowledged the need of a landscape approach. So despite a wealth of information on landscape approaches, that we found that there are actually very few case study examples in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're not out there, that they're just not being reported in the peer-reviewed literature. So what we're now doing is we're undertaking the mammoth task of going through the grey literature, trying to find examples of landscape approach frameworks, and we're hoping that this will provide a bridge in our knowledge base of implementation of approaches on the ground. And just quickly, I'll briefly go over this. Another output from our systematic reviewing process is in the form of an online interactive map. So here, for all of the case studies that we're finding from the peer-reviewed literature and ultimately the grey literature, we're summarising these projects in terms of who's behind the implementation of them, the donors involved, the stakeholders involved, the land use configurations, the challenges that they're trying to address, whether the project focus is agriculture, biodiversity, or soil, in this case in Ethiopia, and also a link to the documentation behind the approach. So what we're hoping is that this will provide a database, central database for everybody to access of landscape approach frameworks and case studies. So if anybody is interested in looking at that map, they can find that at cifor.org/landscape map. So I'll move on to the final section of my talk today. The concept of the landscape approach is clear. We know what it is and why it makes sense to manage trade-offs between conservation and development at a landscape scale. The question we need to address now is, how do we effectively implement landscape approaches? And based on the systematic reviewing process that we've been through at CIFOR, we've identified numerous barriers to the implementation of landscape approaches. So I'll touch on some of those and conclude with some considerations of suggestions to help promote more effective implementation of the framework. So one of the main barriers to slow uptake of the landscape approach amongst policymakers in less developed countries concerns the lack of capacity and resources available. These countries often exhibit weak institutions, yet high demands for land. Another noticeable trend from the literature is that key stakeholders, particularly the private business sector, are rarely involved in landscape approaches, and this participation gap may be inhibiting the effectiveness of landscape approach projects. The absence of powerful private stakeholders poses a risk in that gains achieved through careful multi-stakeholder negotiations could be derailed by major decisions made by a private company operating within the landscape. And private investors in some less developed countries have a history of circumventing local government authorities through agricultural land grabbing, for example. There's also concern that landscape initiatives and coordination are being funded on a short-term or temporary basis, and often from time-limited donor projects from external governments. So if landscape projects were more embedded in local government policies and programs, this may help the longevity of the landscape approach on the ground. Another limitation is a lack of robust and collaborative management, government support and leadership, and the fact that government agencies are still rooted in their silos, particularly in terms of their ability to distribute funds, which are also often limited. And administrative units may not be in the logistical position to support landscape initiatives that cross multiple administrative boundaries. And finally, there are governance concerns. There seems to be a distinct lack of empowerment given to rural communities. Stakeholder engagement is crucial, and the quality of stakeholder engagement is also important, as the degree to which stakeholders' concerns are acknowledged and the investment in building partnerships will ultimately dictate the success or failure of implementing a landscape approach. So to overcome some of these barriers, we've come up with a few suggestions to help aid more effective implementation of landscape approaches. Firstly, we need a coordinated effort from the scientific community on what the landscape approach is and how we deliver a coherent message to policymakers. Hopefully, our systematic review will contribute to this process. We also recognise that we need a stronger evidence base, and we need to explore scenarios and generate more case studies where landscape approaches have been implemented, and also examine their effectiveness. We need to recognise that we're dealing with moving targets. Landscapes are dynamic systems and are constantly changing, and we need a more adaptive management process in place. And there's no single solution to reconciling development and conservation trade-offs, and we need to recognise this, the long-term nature of landscape approaches. simple and quick solutions in isolation have little chance at being effective, although we recognise that short-term goals are very important and necessary as part of a long-term strategy and framework in order to address these moving targets. And there'll need to be regular re-evaluations of intervals within a long-term framework. We also need to recognise that engagement between sectors is key and stakeholder involvement is crucial. Now, this needs to be very carefully structured. There are many examples where stakeholder engagement has been little more than a box-ticking exercise, and applied effectively, it can be very useful, but done without care or consideration can possibly further marginalise or disempower rural communities. And in order to bridge national policies with local practices, there needs to be more engagement with rural communities, and we need to figure out how to give communities a stronger voice within the decision-making processes for landscape management, and also ensure that they're active in the management of landscape projects moving forward. We also need to apply appropriate governance structures. The benefits of a bottom-up approach and advantages of including stakeholders at all levels is well recognised. But we know from experience in the forestry sector that when you try and implement a bottom-up approach in the field, it's actually very difficult to be able to execute the involvement of stakeholders in practice. Conversely, in a report in The Economist last year, they reported by Frances Seymour, ex-DG of CIFOR, she reported that most effective interventions for reducing deforestation have been from a top-down perspective in case studies in Costa Rica and Brazil, for example. So there's certainly arguments from both sides and things that we can learn from those experiences in terms of how we address the governance issues of landscape approaches. We also need to consider impact assessments. We've built a wealth of knowledge related to landscape approaches for land management, but a lot of it is theory and conceptual frameworks, and we need to think about providing a bigger evidence base where these large-scale problems are being tackled effectively. And related to conducting impact assessments, we need to think about tools for more long-term monitoring and evaluation of landscape approaches. We need to think about metrics and measurements for establishing how effective a landscape approach is in practice. So perhaps moving forward, we need to focus our energies on thinking more about toolkit components for assessing objectives of a landscape approach framework. And examples of informal and formal techniques include simple visualization scenarios and land use simulation modeling. I think another speaker is going to talk more about some measurement techniques later, but these generally are still being only used experimentally, so these really do need to be applied more in real-world context to help provide us with a larger evidence base. So I'll wrap up here, and no, it's fine, I'll wrap up. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues at CIFOR, James Reed, Josh Van Vianen and Terry Sutherland, who I work with very closely on this topic. And thank you to everyone here for bearing with me during the technical issues and listening to me today. Thank you very much.
That is truly an impressive review, isn't it? So now you have time to ask questions to Liz again, so please feel free. The lady in the back, please. And use the microphone and please present yourself with your name and your affiliation, please.
Hello. Thank you, Liz, for a very interesting presentation. I'm a PhD student at the Swedish University of Agricultural Science, Malin Gustafsson. The systematic review, you said that the majority of the papers were short-term. And I would just like to know how do you categorize a short-term as a long-term?
Short-term in that when the paper was written or when the case study was documented.
The study, the short-term.
What we found was that many of the documentations of the case studies were written, a couple of years after the project had been implemented, which really isn't enough time to be able to monitor how effective the approach has been and whether it's been successful in meeting the objectives that it originally set out to do. So, and I guess that there's a lot of pressure behind the donors that support those projects, that they want to know results quickly. But that time frame now, a couple of years, really isn't long enough to address the effectiveness of these issues on such a large scale. So that's what I meant about there being more on a short-term basis.
Okay, thank you.
And what time frame would you suggest then for monitoring?
Evaluate. Well, I mean, it's quite pluck a number out, but a good 5 to 10 year framework, I would imagine. And also regular monitoring and reevaluations at different time increments as well, because the landscape is still evolving. So even after 10 years, you still need to keep tabs on what's going on there, and whether a framework in place is still working, and whether that needs to be adapted along the way.
So it's a living target?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Please. Here comes the microphone.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. My name is Susanne von Walter, and I work at actually the SIDA Help Desk for Environment and Climate Change, but here at SLU in Uppsala. My question has to do with the issue of scale, because how have you dealt with that? Because I always get trapped in that corner when I try to think about the landscape approach. At what level should you do you think that, so to say, all assets that are produced by a landscape should be produced?
Defining a scale of a landscape is, it's a bottomless pit. But for us, we wanted to be able to ensure that there were multiple land uses going on in a landscape, and it didn't matter whether that was a landscape of 100 hectares to 1,000 kilometers squared, as long as there were multiple land use practices or a multi-land use configuration going on, where there were different activities all influencing each other that needed to be managed at a landscape scale. That was our rationale behind defining what we had as a landscape.
Thank you very much. One question up to the lady to the left.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and I have some experience of this systematic review, so I know it is really an incredible work.
Please, Gun, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Gun Lidestav, and I work here at the Faculty of Forestry, Swedish University of Agriculture and Sciences. I was surprised by your graph there showing the distribution of the articles that you found relevant, and that most of them were geographically located in Central Africa.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few North America and nothing in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And then considering the barriers that you identified with regards to the implementation, that mostly seem to me be connected to countries with, poor infrastructure, mm-hmm. or a number of difficulties in terms of policy making and governance and so on. So how can you explain this discrepancy between what has been produced in terms of research, mm-hmm. Applying the landscape approach, and the fact that this gap between what you could think of as the reality, mm-hmm. and what is published? Yeah, well,
firstly, the studies that we're looking for are nominally in the humid and dry tropics. So apart from a few anomalies that occurred in North America, which have very strong case studies that have contributed to either coined a new framework or started a new framework, all of the other studies that we've collated are from the humid and dry tropics. This task would be extremely enormous if we included the whole world. So we're very narrowly focused on tropical regions, except if a framework has been started or established in a particular place. And we had to draw the line somewhere. So that's to do with the geographical distribution, but also there's a wealth of literature in Spanish that discuss landscape work in South America, and we don't have the capacity to be able to look at that at the moment. There's certainly scope for that to be another component later, and I guess the high distribution of projects in Africa one reason behind that may be that donors have been supporting those projects more. But as I said in the talk, there's a hell of a lot of other landscape approaches that are occurring in the tropics that I know of that have not necessarily been captured in the peer-reviewed literature, but may well be in the grey literature, and that's the process that we're going through next.
Thank you so much for this. We are really impressed, and we are so happy that you would like to come and join us for this day.
Mm-hmm.
And we are also looking forward and appreciate that you will support us with the producing of a policy brief after this seminar.
Yep.
So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.